On this day, the 5th of October, 1789, the Women's March, or the March of the Women, began. Something I would describe more of the March of the Harridans. So, Paris had been in disarray for many months. France had been in disarray for many years. Louis XVI, the King of France and Navarre, had called a parliament, or an Estates General, to raise taxes and sort out the mess that France had been in. Now, to understand Louis, you must understand a little bit about who he was. He was the great-grandson of Louis XV and the great-great-great-grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Absolute despots. Yet Louis XVI was a very different person. He actually was a part of the Jacobin Club, the same Jacobins that later cut his head off, and his wife's, and abused and murdered his son. He was the person who instigated the reforms that led to the metric system. And it was also he that instigated the reforms that led to the département, the equivalent of counties for France, to make everything more reasonable and sustainable. And it was he who began in many ways the French Revolution. When he called the Estates General, or the États Généraux, he accepted the reforms. He understood that France could not stay as it was. He understood that France as a great country needed to change. It could no longer continue in its medieval ways. And they looked to England and saw how England was thriving, even though they had defeated England just recently during the American Rebellion. Also, Louis XVI was an actual decent man. He never cheated on his wife, didn't have mistresses like many French kings had in the past. He loved his wife, Marie Antoinette, and obviously she has been castigated and lied about over the years by French radicals. They had a very happy life together, and they loved their children. They actually kept their children close. Marie Antoinette breastfed her own children, which was very unusual for those days. Louis XVI, if he had been allowed to, probably could have been the greatest king in all of French history. And instead, he was betrayed, demasculated, overthrown, and murdered. This led France into centuries of instability, chaos, and the consequences of which we do not know the result. The Chinese premier was once asked, "What do you think the consequences of the French Revolution were?" And he replied, "It's too soon to tell." How true that was. The Duc d'Orléans, of the same house of Bourbon, but a cadet branch, had despised his cousin Louis for many years. Before the French Revolution and during, he hoarded grains, wheat. He bought it up and kept it in warehouses. The reason was he believed he and his family should be on the throne. And he was willing to see France burn so he could be king of the ashes. The Duc d'Orléans, unfortunately, outplayed himself. He voted for Louis's death, and yet that did not save himself. He died on the guillotine. However, his son did eventually become king in 1830. Didn't last long though. 18 years and he was gone. And the Orleanists have only had one king upon the throne of France. And even then, he was called the King of the French and not the King of France. Cheap Walmart model of what true royalty is. And so, the Duc d'Orléans had been hoarding grain, had been instigating the revolutionaries and the radicals, hoping that this would be his chance. And on this day, starving people in Paris, annoyed that they could not get even bread, took weapons and decided to march out to Versailles, where the king, the royal family, and the parliament were. It was called National Assembly at this point, but it was a similar thing. Do you really think that a bunch of women would do this? They might have women in front of them and around them, but this was obviously a propaganda thing by the revolutionaries. They were using the women to emasculate the king. They marched out to Versailles. They surrounded it. They assaulted it. Again, would some average women in 18th century France be doing this with weapons? Of course not. This was a coup, probably led by the Duc d'Orléans, or at least hoped and invited by him. The royal family, the king, and the parliament were marched back to Paris. And we know what happened after this. The king was murdered. The queen was murdered. The new king, Louis's son, Louis XVII, was sexually abused, starved, beaten, and kept in a cell. He lived for a couple of years, but as a child, he couldn't take the abuse, the beatings, the sexual abuse, the emotional abuse, and he died. He starved to death. Lice in his hair, filled with parasites. France has suffered because of what happened on that day. Every regime since has been illegitimate in the minds of French people. They've protested, They caused more revolutions. There have been more families in control. None of them have had the legitimacy of the original French royal family. And this tragedy began on this day, the 5th of October, 1789. Come back tomorrow for some more. Subscribe if you like these videos, and like and comment. Thank you.